family caught in the middle of an FBI wrong house raid could learn whether their case will go to trial.
I was the first one to wake up because I heard a really big bang, and it woke me up.
Sued the federal government, accusing FBI agents of assault and battery, false arrest, and other violations.
They threw in a flash bomb grenades, and you just see the lights and hear the sound.
They said, well, what's your address? And so I told them the address, and just immediately it just kind of got really quiet.
Of the closet, and it's an agent in front of me with a gun pointing to my face with a bright light.
Supreme Court ruled victims like the Martins can sue the federal government for wrong house raids nationwide.
I hear them say we got to go up the street, and basically we were at the wrong house.
Because there has been, they know what they did was wrong. They know they messed up, but there has been no accountability.
A family is sound asleep in their home in suburban Atlanta. It's before dawn. Everything is quiet. And then, without any warning whatsoever, federal agents smash through the front door, detonate flashbang grenades inside the house, drag everyone out in handcuffs, and hold a woman at gunpoint while her 7-year-old child watches in terror. There's just one small problem. They hit the wrong house. The people inside had absolutely nothing to do with anything. And when that family tried to hold the government responsible for destroying their sense of safety, for traumatizing their child, for violating their home in the most aggressive way possible, the government turned around and said, "Sorry, you can't sue us. Our agents were using their judgment, and that judgment is protected." That argument traveled all the way to the highest court in the land, and the Supreme Court of the United States came back with something you almost never see, a completely unanimous 9-0 decision telling the government it was wrong. But the story didn't end there. Not even close. Because the case was sent back down to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, and that court just reheard arguments in light of what the Supreme Court said. What happened during those arguments and what's developed in the days since is sending some very strong signals about where this is heading, and the implications could reshape how the government is held accountable when law enforcement makes catastrophic mistakes. Let's go back to where this all started, because the details of what happened to this family are important for understanding why this case matters so much. Back in 2017, the FBI was planning a pre-dawn raid as part of an ongoing investigation. They had a warrant, they had a target address, they had a team assembled and ready to go. But one of the agents involved made a decision that would change everything. Instead of using official navigation tools, instead of cross-referencing the address with satellite imagery or confirming the target location through any reliable verification method, the agent plugged the warrant address into his personal GPS device. And according to what was later presented in court, that GPS routed him to the wrong location. Not a completely different neighborhood, not the other side of town. The wrong house was roughly 3 doors down from the actual target, essentially almost a block over. That's how close they were to getting it right, and yet they got it catastrophically, life-alteringly wrong. The home they ended up at belonged to Katrina Martin. She lived there with her boyfriend and their young son. None of them had any connection to the FBI's investigation. None of them were suspects. None of them had any idea why armed federal agents were about to come crashing into their lives. When the agents arrived, they didn't knock, they didn't announce themselves, and wait. They smashed in the front door and immediately deployed flashbang grenades inside the residence. These are military-grade devices designed to disorient people through blinding light and deafening sound. Inside the home, Katrina and her boyfriend heard the chaos and did what most people would do. They grabbed a shotgun and hid in a closet, terrified, believing they were being attacked by intruders. The agents found them, pulled them out, put them in handcuffs, and pointed firearms directly at them. Katrina was dragged outside barely dressed. Her boyfriend was restrained on the ground, and their 7-year-old son was pulled from the home as well, witnessing the entire nightmare unfold around him. It wasn't until after the family had been fully detained and the agents began searching the residence that someone finally noticed the mistake. One of the agents spotted mail sitting on a coffee table. The address on that mail didn't match the address on the warrant. That was the moment the realization hit. They were in the wrong house. They had terrorized an innocent family. They had deployed explosive devices inside a home where a child was sleeping, and it was all because of a GPS error that nobody bothered to double-check.
Family caught in the middle of an FBI wrong house raid could learn whether their case will go to trial.
They threw in a flash bomb grenades, and you just see the lights and hear the sound.
They said, well, what's your address? And so I told him the address, and just immediately it just kind of got really quiet. I hear him say we got to go up the street, and basically we were at the wrong house.
The agents released the family, reportedly told them they would come back to explain what happened, and then moved on to the correct address to execute the actual warrant. Just like that, as if the trauma they had just inflicted was simply an inconvenience to be noted and moved past. But the Martin family wasn't willing to just move past it. They did what any reasonable person would do. They sought accountability. They filed a lawsuit against the federal government under a law called the Federal Tort Claims Act, commonly known as the FTCA. This is one of the primary legal mechanisms that allows ordinary citizens to sue the federal government when its employees cause harm through negligent or wrongful conduct. It's a critical piece of legislation because without it, the government would enjoy near total immunity from civil liability in situations exactly like this one. However, the government raised a defense that threatened to shut the entire case down before it ever reached a courtroom. They invoked what's called the discretionary function exception to the FTCA. This exception exists to protect the government from lawsuits that challenge policy-level decisions, the kinds of choices that involve weighing competing priorities, allocating resources, or balancing public interests. The idea behind it makes some sense in theory. You don't want every policy disagreement turning into a lawsuit. But the way the government applied it here was, to put it mildly, a stretch. Their argument was essentially this: every decision the agents made leading up to and during the raid, including how they navigated to the location, how they verified the address, and how they chose to execute the operation, involved the exercise of discretionary judgment. And because those decisions involved judgment, the government claimed they fell under the discretionary function exception and therefore couldn't be challenged in court. The lower courts initially sided with the government. The case was dismissed, and for a time, it looked like the Martin family would have no legal recourse at all. But then the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case, and everything changed. In a ruling that was unanimous across all 9 justices, a level of agreement that is genuinely rare on the current court, the Supreme Court rejected the government's reasoning. The court made a critical distinction that cuts to the heart of this entire legal battle. Having discretion doesn't automatically mean that discretion is the kind protected by the exception. The government has to demonstrate that the decisions in question were actually grounded in legitimate policy considerations. A mistake isn't a policy choice. Getting the address wrong isn't a strategic calculation. Failing to verify that you're at the right house before detonating grenades inside it isn't a protected exercise of governmental judgment. It's just negligence. And negligence, the court effectively said, is something the government can and should be held accountable for. With that 9-0 ruling in hand, the Supreme Court sent the case back down to the 11th Circuit with instructions to apply the correct legal standard and take a fresh look at the facts. And the 11th Circuit moved quickly. Oral arguments were scheduled and held, and what happened during those arguments is extremely revealing about where the judges' heads are at. Throughout the hearing, the panel of judges zeroed in on one fundamental question that the government clearly struggled to answer. Where exactly is the line between a protected policy decision and a basic operational failure? Multiple judges pressed the government's attorneys on this point, and the questioning was pointed. How, the judges wanted to know, can executing a warrant at the wrong address possibly qualify as a protected exercise of discretion? The act of identifying the correct house isn't a policy call. It's not a strategic trade-off. It's the absolute bare minimum prerequisite for lawfully executing a search warrant. If you can't even get the address right, nothing else about the operation matters. The judges also expressed concern about the broader implications of the government's theory.
The Supreme Court ruled victims like the Martins can sue the federal government for wrong house raids nationwide.
Of the closet, and it's an agent in front of me with a gun pointing to my face with a bright light, because they know what they did was wrong. They know they messed up, but there has been no accountability.
If the government's argument prevailed, if failing to verify a target address could be shielded as discretionary judgment, then what couldn't be? One of the judges made this point explicitly during the arguments, noting that almost every human action involves some element of choice or judgment. If that's the standard, then virtually every mistake law enforcement makes during any operation, would be immune from legal challenge. The discretionary function exception would swallow the entire FTCA, leaving citizens with no meaningful ability to hold the government accountable for even the most egregious errors. The government's attorneys were also repeatedly asked to explain how their position could possibly be consistent with what the Supreme Court just said in its unanimous ruling. And by multiple accounts, the government struggled significantly to provide a coherent answer. They essentially doubled down on the same arguments they had been making from the beginning, that the surveillance, navigation, and execution of the raid all involved discretionary choices, and that because no specific written rule dictated exactly how the agents had to verify the address, the exception should apply. Some of the agents had apparently claimed during earlier proceedings that it was dark when they arrived, that the target home didn't have visible address numbers, that they couldn't check mailboxes without potentially alerting the suspects, and that the house and a vehicle parked outside looked approximately right. Approximately right, that was apparently sufficient justification for deploying flashbang grenades inside a family's home. On the other side, the attorneys representing the Martin family presented a much more straightforward argument that seemed to land with considerably more force. Their position was simple and direct. This case isn't about policy, it's about competence. The FBI had a non-discretionary obligation to execute the warrant at the correct address. Hitting the right house isn't a judgment call that involves weighing competing policy interests. It's the foundational requirement of the entire operation. Everything else flows from getting that one thing right, and they didn't. That argument appeared to resonate clearly with the judges on the panel. Now here's where the most recent developments become particularly significant. At the conclusion of the oral arguments, the court told both parties that it would notify them if it wanted additional briefing on how the Supreme Court's decision impacts certain negligence issues in the case. The court indicated it would make that request within roughly a week if it determined further briefing was necessary. That window has now passed, and no such request has been made. No order has been issued. No additional briefing has been called for, and that silence speaks volumes. When a court tells the parties it might ask for more information and then doesn't, the most logical interpretation is that the judges have concluded they already possess everything they need to render a decision. They don't need more arguments. They don't need more legal analysis. They're ready to move forward. And that strongly suggests the 11th Circuit is now actively working toward issuing its ruling on the merits. Based on the tone and direction of the oral arguments, there are several possible outcomes, but the most likely scenario appears to be that the 11th Circuit rules against the government and allows the Martin family's case to proceed. The judges seemed genuinely troubled by the consequences of accepting the government's position. If wrong house raids are effectively immune from legal challenge because every operational decision can be characterized as discretionary, that represents an enormous expansion of government immunity, one that goes well beyond anything the Supreme Court has endorsed. The court might draw a clear, bright-line distinction between protected policy decisions and basic operational negligence. Or it might issue a narrower ruling that simply says getting the wrong house on a warrant is such a clear-cut error that it falls outside the discretionary function exception without addressing the broader boundaries of that exception in detail. Either way, the government's position appears dramatically weaker now than it did before the Supreme Court intervened. What makes this case so significant isn't just about one family in Atlanta, though what happened to the Martin family alone would be enough to demand accountability. It's about the principle at stake. If the government can raid the wrong home, traumatize innocent people, endanger a child, and then hide behind immunity by calling it a discretionary judgment call, then the protections that are supposed to exist for ordinary citizens become meaningless. The FTCA exists specifically so that when the government harms people through negligence, those people have a path to justice. The discretionary function exception was never intended to be a blanket shield against all accountability, and the Supreme Court just told the entire legal system exactly that, with 9 votes and 0 dissents. This case is now at a critical juncture. The Supreme Court has spoken unanimously. The 11th Circuit has heard fresh arguments. No additional briefing has been requested. A ruling is likely coming soon, and based on everything we've seen, the Martin family appears to be in the strongest position they've occupied at any point in this multi-year legal battle. Whatever the 11th Circuit decides, will send a powerful message about whether the government can be held to the most basic standard of competence when it uses force against its own citizens. That's it for today, folks. See you in the next video.